Morning, and thank you, Sally, for, I think, too much introduction. Right, we've heard this morning really about the big picture and ambitions for Scotland, tackling the climate emergency and opportunities, building a successful, fair and green economy, and doing these things in a way that improves well-being and is inclusive. It's now 2 years, 2 very rapid years actually, since our first conference, and since we first set out the major themes of work for the Land Commission. And in that time, I think our work has developed across both urban and rural Scotland. And across the breadth of that, I think it's really clear that the way we own and use land in Scotland is central to so many of our big public policy challenges. And that's why the collaborations we're developing with many of you are so important to us. Of course, land reform is a means to an end, as we've heard already this morning. It is about unlocking opportunity, about stimulating activity, supporting fair and inclusive growth. It's about getting the right mix of rights and responsibilities, an effective mix that makes the most of land as a national asset and, of course, a local asset. An asset that's central to providing the housing we need and infrastructure, to community identity and development, to business growth and opportunity, to climate action and making natural systems work, and, of course, simply to enjoying the environment that we're so proud of in Scotland. And I think it's clear that today's big challenges in all of these need not just collaboration, but actually a willingness to rethink how we organise our systems and ways of doing things. And we need to be willing to rethink the way that we own and use land as one of our most fundamental assets in Scotland, and how we share the risks, rewards and benefits associated with that. So I want to say a little about each of the 4 big areas of work that we're focused on to look at progress and direction. Now, first up, vacant and derelict land. We've heard from Steve already why tackling Scotland's vacant and derelict land is a huge opportunity to deliver improved well-being, growth and climate action. And of course, in parts of Scotland where it's particularly needed, the very definition of place-based and inclusive growth. And I'm really delighted that the task force that we established with CEPA and with Steve's chairing has unlocked a real and I think growing commitment across public bodies, government, the community and private sectors to transform the way we bring these sites back into productive use. We recently published the task force's statement of intent, which sets out how we can do this, and that's informed by research that analyses the sites and the challenges involved. And we'll soon be publishing a report looking at the consequences of vacant and derelict land on communities and commissioning further work on the wide economic impacts that actually bringing these sites back into productive use brings. And all of this is intended to support the business case for financing and doing things differently on these sites. But I think above all, as I'm sure you've picked up already, I think the task force is committed to actually mainstreaming the changes we need. This is not a start and finish project. This is something where we actually need to embed the changes in culture and practice. And as well as tackling the existing legacy, we need to turn off the tap. We need to prevent the future legacy of vacant derelict sites. Let's spot where they're going to come from and make sure that we're intervening to turn off that potential legacy now. And I think perhaps that's one of the biggest cultural shifts that we'll need to make in doing this. Beyond vacant and derelict land, we're also focused on housing supply, housing land supply. How do we be more proactive in enabling land to come forward in the right place, at the right time, at the right price to actually enable housing? The Scottish Government's proposed Housing 2040 vision sets out the principle that the balance in the housing system needs to shift from being a means to store wealth to providing high-quality homes for living in. And it recognises the need for more proactive land supply and lower-cost land supply to help achieve that. Now, to support this, we've reviewed previous experience of land value capture, and we've been working with Scottish Futures Trust to look at ways to improve delivery of infrastructure costs, making initial recommendations on that to government. The purpose in all this, of course, is to actually use a fair share of the land value to help make development happen. And I think a key message coming out of this work already is that an effective approach to this is not just about land values, but it actually relies on a much more proactive approach within the public sector to sharing the risks and rewards fairly across both the public and private sectors. It's as much about culture change, this, as it is about legislative and policy change, I think. And this week, of course, the Scottish Government confirmed in their work programme for implementing the Planning Act that they'll continue to work on a package of proposals for land assembly and land value capture, and we'll be pleased to be working with them over the coming year in doing that. Alongside this, we'll be publishing reports shortly looking at the issue of land banking and the relationship between land values and house prices, and this will inform work over the coming year that will lead to recommendations on improving the options for housing land supply. And as part of that, of course, we've also commissioned work to look specifically at rural and remote areas, which face hugely challenging population projections over the next 30 years. We're looking at the role of land ownership and land values in releasing effective land for housing in these places and supporting ambitions for rural repopulation and growth. Now, the second area I want to focus on is our focus on modernising land ownership. Last year, we made recommendations to government on what we think is needed to normalise community ownership as an option across Scotland. Now, we do see community ownership as an effective way to deliver regeneration and inclusive growth, not least because of the way it can unlock social capital. And I think this is increasingly evident in an urban as well as a rural context now. It should be normal for communities to be able to own the assets and buildings they need to deliver their ambitions. And it should also be normal, while rights to buy are important, it should also be normal for them to be able to buy land and buildings in a planned, proactive and negotiated way. And actually that's why we particularly welcome the opportunity created at Buccleuch, for example, where the estate has paused the sale of Lang & Moor to negotiate directly with local community groups. And I think we should acknowledge, let's acknowledge this kind of change in culture and practice is not always easy to navigate immediately, but it is the kind of change we need to make this a more normal approach. The community land sector, I think, is evolving significantly in Scotland. And I think we can also learn much from international experience, different community land ownership models. We'll shortly be publishing some work that looks at international experience of community, communal and municipal land ownership in countries right around the world. And I think this opens up some really interesting questions for Scotland to think about different or improved governance models. James is going to talk more this afternoon about the themes emerging from our international work, looking at international experience across many strands of our work, so I won't preempt more of what he's going to say. But I think it really does open up some interesting new ideas for us to be thinking about doing things differently in Scotland. And just last month, we published some initial work, research and thinking on common good land. Now, this ancient form of legal ownership could actually drive a new wave of community-owned assets in our towns and cities, harnessed to deliver benefit for regeneration, the economy and the environment, if we reframe the governance and legal status and how that land is owned and managed. I think another opportunity there, another example where thinking about different forms of governance and different models could open up big opportunities for us. So community ownership is a success story, and one I think that is developing rapidly. But of course, we must also have a vision for a much wider, a diverse and dynamic private sector of land ownership that creates opportunities and public value. Now, the Cabinet Secretary referred to the report we published in March this year on scale and concentration of land ownership. The goal of a more diverse pattern of ownership is, of course, not to change the map of ownership for its own sake. It's to actually make sure that the way we organise our system of land ownership unlocks rather than constrains opportunity. Our research shows at the moment that concentration of land ownership can constrain opportunities, and the core risks and issues are really about power and participation. Now, this is perhaps not a surprise to many of you. In much of our economy, of course, we're used to regulating concentrations of power. And the themes of power and participation are common language across public policy today, both in public service design, citizen engagement. So ministers have asked us to progress the recommendations we made, and I'm really grateful to many of you and others that have engaged with us over the last few months in thinking these through. Over the coming year, we're going to be working with Scottish Government colleagues to look at legislative options, including the public interest test idea the Cabinet Secretary talked about earlier. We'll be looking at policy options to diversify the pattern of land ownership, including looking at tax and fiscal influences, and of course the leadership role that public landowners can play. And we'll work directly with the landowning sectors to support good practice that can help address some of the risks and opportunities that we've identified here. But across all this work on ownership and governance, our focus really is on modernising the ways we own land in Scotland to unlock opportunities and help drive productivity and public value. Now, Shona's going to talk a bit later on this morning about the economic relationships between land ownership and inclusive growth. So I won't say any more about that just now. The third main area that I want to turn to is really our work on land use decision making and good practice. Now, together with many of you over the last year, we've focused heavily on supporting community engagement in land use decisions, helping people deliver in practice the expectations that the government have set out in their guidance for engaging communities and land. And I have to say, I think the shared commitment across stakeholders for this is hugely positive. Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement creates a clear framework now for the way we make decisions about land and to make that more inclusive. So a wide range of people are not just influencing, but actually able to benefit from decisions about land. And I think there's no doubt over the next decade or so that we're going to see some pretty significant land use changes, driven not least by the response to the climate emergency. How we navigate these in a fair and productive way is going to be really important. And the second panel discussion this afternoon will start to explore how Scotland's Land Rights and Responsibilities approach can help guide us in this. But there is a huge amount of value that I think can be delivered through changes in practice and culture. Genuine engagement and collaboration is the basis for so many good outcomes. In an urban context, the partnership work we've done with SURF and Young Scott over the last year, together with work by Community Land Scotland and DTAS, I think is really showing the significant potential of better and wider engagement in urban land use decisions. And in the rural sector, it's really encouraging to see, I think, an increasing appetite and recognition for the benefits of effective community engagement. As one land agent put it to me recently, we need to be talking about people as much as we talk about property. Actually, I think that's a pretty good guiding principle for much of this. So we're pleased to be working with a number of estates, communities, land managers, to help develop and support community engagement plans and delivery. We're learning as much from that experience as you are. This is about how we do these things, how we deliver these things in practice in ways that work. And I'm hopeful that when the Scottish Government come around in about a year's time or so to review their guidance on engaging communities, that we'll be able to point to an ongoing shift in culture and practice. It is encouraging to see people using the protocol on community engagement that we published earlier in the year. Over the next year, we're going to put significant emphasis on a programme of good practice to support land rights and responsibilities. Working with sector bodies, agents and advisors, we'll be putting together a package of guidance, protocols, case studies, CPD, that will help all parties, I think, with practical implementation of the expectations around land rights and responsibilities. And then, as you've heard this morning, on a wider note in terms of land use decision making, we're also going to go on with government to look at how both the land use strategy and the land rights and responsibilities statement can be improved in terms of delivering and supporting action on climate change. So the fourth area I want to turn to is, of course, our work on agricultural holdings. And here, I think there's much we can learn from the experience of the Tenant Farming Commissioner role and the focus on improving relationships. It's been really positive to hear feedback on the value of the Tenant Farming Commissioner codes of practice and guidance, and of course the approach of helping parties reach a mutually acceptable conclusion. And this kind of approach surely has wider value in our wider work as a land commission. I'm particularly pleased that we've been able to trial the use of mediation in helping parties resolve disputes. I think we've learned a lot from this experience, actually, and see significant potential for the wider use of mediation, not just in the agricultural sector, but in the wider land use sector. And it's interesting at the same time, actually, to see the Planning Act promoting the use of mediation more within the planning system, and the National Access Forum starting to consider the role of mediation within outdoor access. I think this potentially has a huge and constructive role to play in wider land use. As well as landlord-tenant relationships, obviously our work on agricultural holdings focuses on the availability of land for agriculture, something fundamental to growth, productivity, and innovation in the sector. We've published research and guidance on joint venture options, and are pleased to be supporting and helping fund the next stage of that, a land matching service, with wide partner support, something in the programme for government, and of course just launched last week by Fergus Ewing. And we'll certainly continue to focus on ways to open up new opportunities through joint ventures, and how succession routes can open up opportunities, matching those leaving the sector with those wanting to come in. So, across all these areas of work, it feels to me like there is lots of fresh thinking, new discussions, and an openness to doing things differently. Can we start to draw out some themes from this? First, I think it's clear that land is on the front line of many big public policy challenges, certainly the climate emergency, infrastructure, inclusive growth. I think it's also increasingly apparent that there are opportunities to use and share the inherent value of land more effectively to unlock growth, productivity, public value, to help make things happen, essentially. This may be clearest in relation to housing, supply and development, but I think actually it's just as relevant to wider land use opportunities. And an emphasis on governance, I think, is increasingly clear. Good governance and land ownership, of course, can address some of the risks in our current system, and more radically, we should be exploring new and improved governance models. Let's look at international experience, and perhaps start to think beyond some of the rigid lines of public, private, NGO and community sectors that we're used to, and look at how we might mix these up a bit to benefit from cross-sector expertise and benefit. Underlying all this, I think, is a need to articulate really clearly what the public interest in land is. And this, I think, will be certainly at the core of the work that we're going to do, looking at the land use strategy and the land rights and responsibility statement in relation to climate and wider public value. So across all the areas of work I've touched on, I think land reform continually reminds us that it's about unlocking opportunities for innovation, growth, productivity, for communities, development, regeneration, and fundamentally for more people to benefit from land. So to return to where I started, I think we need to be willing to think widely about how we organise and evolve the way we own and use land in Scotland. And actually the mix of people in this room today, I think, reinforces my confidence that together we can do this well in Scotland. For our part, we certainly need both your continued collaboration and challenge in doing this. So a final thought, looking both back and ahead. This year, of course, is the centenary of the Land Settlement Act, 1919. through which the Lloyd George government enabled the Board of Agriculture to purchase and settle land anywhere in Scotland, driven in part by a sense of obligation to returning servicemen. That legacy, of course, is still here today in the communities and the culture that it established. And I think it's interesting to reflect on that period of radical reform 100 years ago, at a time now when we face challenging population projections in many of these rural and remote parts of Scotland. And again, it reminds us, I think, that land reform is about delivering some very practical outcomes that can have a real lasting legacy. So looking ahead, as others have done, looking ahead to next year, Scotland, of course, has the privilege of hosting the Climate Summit. And as you heard this morning, ministers will be hosting an international land reform conference as well. So what a great opportunity to showcase the joined-up way Scotland is starting to think now about land, climate, and a fair economy. Let's make the most of it. Thank you.